I'm Mr. Hassan, and today we're going to be doing a flipped classroom. What a flipped classroom is when you guys at home are watching me give a lecture on video at home. It's pretty cool. And then what's going to happen is once we're done watching video, you'll come into class, and during your IHT or possibly during your 8th period, the teacher will be here and we'll be working on the homework with you. And that's what a flipped classroom is. So today we're going to start with lesson 3.1 in our big books, or our phone books as Mr. Allhouse calls them. And that's on page 97. So you're going to want to have your textbook out and you're going to want to be open to page 97. The first thing that page 97 talks about is integers. And what an integer is the set of whole numbers and their opposites. So pretty easy to understand. An integer is pretty much any whole number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 13, 2,000, 1,684, 1,221. Those are all whole numbers and they're all integers as well. An integer can also be negative. So an integer can also fall to the left side of 0. So here I have my number line. I've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pretty simple. But an integer can also represent a negative number, such as -1, -2, -3, and -4. Those are all integers as well. So again, I have numbers that are to the right of my 0 and numbers that are left of my 0. Today we're also going to talk about opposites. And all an opposite is an opposite is a number that's considered opposite if it's the same distance from 0 but on a different side of the number line. So for example, I've got the number 1 here. The opposite of the number 1 is -1 because they are both 1 away from 0 but on opposite sides of my 0. So the opposite of 1 is -1. The opposite of 2, because I'm 2 away from the number line, is going to be a -2. So again, 2 is my integer. The opposite of 2 is -2. Here I have -3. What do you think the opposite of -3 is going to be? That's right. It's going to be 3. So the opposite of -3 is 3. The opposite of 4 would be -4. Let's take a look at our textbooks on page 97, underneath where it says unlock the problem, and read it together. Okay, so we're back, and here we are on page 97 of our textbook, lesson 3.1, understanding positive and negative integers, or understanding positive and negative numbers. Just to review, integers are the set of whole numbers and their opposites. Two numbers are opposites if they are the same distance from 0 on the number line, but on different sides of 0. For example, the integers +3 and -3 are opposites. 0 is its own opposite. Notice that I did not read this as +3 and -3. These are integers, and we should read them as +3 and -3. Positive numbers are located to the right of the 0 on the number line, and negative numbers are located to the left. So let's take a look at unlock the problem. The temperature at the start of a 2009 Major League Baseball playoff game between the Colorado Rockies and the Philadelphia Phillies, the best team in baseball, was 2 degrees Celsius. The temperature at the end of the game was -4 degrees Celsius. What is the opposite of each temperature? This should be fairly easy to figure out, at least I hope it is. The first section here says to graph each integer and its opposite on a number line. So here's my number line. These are the number lines that we're going to use. The first part of it says here, A, number 2. So let's put number 2 and let's mark that on our number line. And I'm going to label it with the letter A so that I know that that's the problem that I'm working on. The integer 2, here we go. The integer 2 is on the blank side of 0. Well, 2 is on which side of 0? It's going to be the right. Graph the opposite of 2 at, And as we had discussed earlier, further up at the top of the page, an opposite, and also in the front of the room, the opposite of 2 is going to be an equal distance away from 0, so 2 away from 0, but on the opposite side of 0. So here we're on the right, now we're going to be on the left, and we're going to be 2 away from 0. So the answer is -2. And we want to graph that on our number line as well. So I'm going to make a mark here for my opposite. So the opposite of 2 degrees Celsius is -2 degrees Celsius. B says -4. So we're going to come over here and we're going to graph -4 on our line. Can we see that? Let me move this page up a little bit just so we can get a better look. There we go. So again, B says -4. So let's graph on our graph -4. And we're going to label that B for problem B. Okay. The integer -4 is on the blank side of 0. Well, it's a negative number, and we know that all negative numbers are always going to be on the left side of 0. Graph the opposite of -4 at, well, what's going to be the answer? We're 4 away from 0 on the left side, so we want to graph 4 away from 0 on the right side. And so we graph the opposite of -4 at 4. And therefore the opposite of -4 degrees Celsius is 4 degrees Celsius. Let's turn the page. Okay, there we go. Let's go over example number 1 together. Example 1. Name the integer that represents the situation and tell what 0 represents in that situation. This can get a little confusing, so we want to pay close attention and make sure that we're following along. Situation. A team loses 10 yards on a football play. Well, that's pretty easy. If you lose something, it's going away. That's a negative impact. We don't want to lose 10 yards on a football play, so that's going to be a negative integer, -10. What does 0 represent? So what they're asking you here is what would happen if the football team lost 0 yards? What would that mean? And so that 0 would mean that the team neither gained a yard or lost a yard. Let's look at the second example. A point in Yuma, Arizona is 70 feet above sea level. Well, if it's above sea level, we're going to say that that's what kind of integer? That's a positive integer. It's going to be a positive 70. What would 0 represent? Well, if they're saying that it's 70 feet above sea level, 0 would mean that we were at sea level. We weren't any feet above sea level, and we weren't any feet below sea level. So 0 represents sea level. Neither above or below. A temperature of 40 degrees below 0 was recorded in Missouri. Well, what would that integer look like? Again, we're 40 degrees below 0. So if we're going to be below 0, that's going to end up being a negative integer. And we're 40 degrees below, so we have -40. Well, what would 0 represent in this situation? They're telling us right in this problem. Below 0. So a temperature of 0 degrees would mean that we were at 0 degrees. We wouldn't be it would be a positive temperature and it wouldn't be a negative temperature. So 0 would represent, let me cross that out, 0 would represent that we are neither positive or negative. in relationship to our temperature. All right. Larry withdraws $30 from his bank account. If he's withdrawing money from his bank account, does he have less money in his bank account or more money in his bank account? Well, Larry's going to have less money in his bank account. So we're going to have, that's going to be a negative integer. And it's going to be a negative 30. Now this is where it gets tricky when we ask ourselves, what does 0 represent? 0 doesn't mean that Larry has $0 in his bank account. 0 in this case, when we're talking about taking $30 out, 0 represents the amount of money Larry had in there before he took any money out. So I'm going to write down the amount before the withdrawal. 0 in this instance represents the money that Larry had, whatever amount that was. We don't know, it doesn't tell us. But whatever amount Larry had before he took his $30 out, that's what 0 represents. Let's look at the next one. Trisha's golf score was 7 strokes below par. Well, what does that mean? Let's think about it. If she were above par, well, that's a positive integer, but she's below par. So that's going to be a negative integer. So we're going to say minus 7. What does 0 represent here? Again, 0 doesn't represent 0, a score of 0. What 0 represents here is par. And if you don't know a lot about golf, maybe you've been mini golfing or maybe you've been golfing. But on a golf course, on a professional golf course, if I were to shoot 72, well, that might be par for that particular course. So if I were to shoot 7 below par, well, then I just shot a 65, not 0. I wouldn't be 7 below. I would have shot 7 below par. 7 below 72 is 65, and that's what I would have shot. If I were 7 above par, well, 72 was par for that course. I would be 7 above that, so that means that I would have shot a 79. So when they ask us here, what does 0 represent? Well, 0 would represent par, or whatever par was for that course. So I'm going to write down, what does 0 represent? Well, 0 represents par for that course. I think that's a tricky one because if you don't know anything about golf, it's going to be really hard to answer. All right, so let's take a look at example number 2. I am going to cross off everything the book says below this line because it is horribly confusing the way they have it written. And I can't stand it. This is the 3rd time I've videotaped this section alone because I get to the bottom and my tongue gets all twisted and tied. So I'm just going to cross it off and we're going to talk about this together and work through the problem together. So example number 2 says, use a number line to find the negative of -3. Another way to think about that is the opposite of -3. They also want us to find the opposite of the opposite of 3. So they're asking us to do 2 separate things. The first one is to find, using a number line to find the opposite of -3 or the opposite of -3. But they also want us to find the opposite of 3. So let's take the first problem. Let's take this part of the problem. Use a number line to find the opposite of -3. Well, here's -3 on my number line. And as we all know, -3 is 3 away from 0. To find the opposite, I want to be on the opposite side of 0 and the same distance away, which is going to be 3. So the first part of our problem, the opposite of -3 is 3. Pretty simple. The second part of the problem says the opposite of 3. Now watch what happens when we do this. We're going to start with 3 here on my number line. So here I am at 3. So now we have to find the opposite of 3. This is so ridiculous, it drives me crazy. So here's the opposite of 3. Well, that's going to be negative 3. And then we have to find the opposite of that. And it's going to take me back to 3 again. So the opposite of 3 is 3. The opposite of 5 would be 5. The opposite of negative 3 would be negative 3. It's kind of a silly way to think about it, but there are some questions in the textbook that are going to ask you that. Let's slide the book up a little bit and take a look at Try This.
Third, I know we're gonna do today.
So here we are at Try This. Try this. Write the opposite of the integer. The opposite of the opposite. Oh boy. Here we go. So the opposite of 9 would be negative 9. The opposite of that would bring us back to 9 again. Pretty simple. Or positive 9. The opposite of negative 12, well, the opposite of negative 12 is 12. And then the opposite of that would bring us right back to negative 12 again. 0. Well, 0 doesn't have any opposites. We can go opposite a billion different times and we'd still be on 0. So the opposite of 0 is 0. The next one says, a plane's altitude changes by negative 1,000 feet. Is the plane going up or down? Well, if the altitude is going negative 1,000, what do you think? Is the plane traveling further from the Earth's surface or closer to the Earth's surface? Is it losing altitude, getting closer to the Earth's surface? Or is it gaining altitude, getting further away from the Earth's surface? Well, negative 1,000 feet, the plane's going down. The plane is going down because it's losing altitude. The plane is going down, I'm going to erase my period here, because it is losing altitude. Had to make sure I spelled altitude right. All right, so we're going to take a break right now. And what I'd like you to do is, during our little break here, is I'd like you to open up your practice books to page 49. Alright, so here we are on page 49 in our practice books. As you can see, we're on lesson 3.1. Understand positive and negative integers. The first set of directions tells us to graph the integer and its opposite on a number line. Alright, so we have to graph both. Now, number 1, they give us the answer. The opposite of negative 6 is positive 6, but they didn't graph it. It's pretty easy. Let's graph negative 6. We'll just put a little mark right there. And the opposite of 6 is 6, so we'll mark that on our graph as well. Number 2 says 3. So let's graph 3. And now we need to graph the opposite of 3. So again, we need to be 3 away from 0, this time on the left of 0. And so the opposite of 3 is going to be negative 3. Here's number 3. They give us 10, so we'll graph 10 on the number line. And the opposite of 10, well again, the 10 is on the right of 0. To be the opposite, we want to be on the left of 0, and we want to be the same distance away from 0 as 10. So again, on the left, 10 away is going to take us to negative 10. Number 4 says negative 8. Let's graph negative 8. And now I want to find the opposite. Well, I'm 8 away from 0 on the right side. I need to be 8 away from 0 on the left side, and that's going to take me to 8 on the positive side, positive 8. All right, I'm going to slide my book up here a little bit. Name the integer that represents the situation and tell what 0 represents in that situation. So number 5 says, Michael, which by the way is a wonderful name, Michael withdrew $60 from his checking account. Well, if Michael's taking $60, he's withdrawing $60. He is taking it away. What kind of integer is that going to be? That's right. It's going to be a negative integer, negative 60. In this case, what does 0 represent? And again, this is a very similar problem to the one we saw in our big books, in our textbooks. 0 in this instance would represent the money that Michael had before he withdrew money. They're not saying that Michael had $0 in his bank account. What they're saying is Michael had a certain amount of money and he took $60 away from that. So in this case, the 0 represents the amount of money Michael had before his withdrawal. Number 6. Raquel gained 12 points while playing a video game. Video games. Good times. Raquel gained 12 points while playing a video game. Well, Raquel gained 12 points. Raquel didn't lose 12 points, she gained 12 points. So what kind of integer is this going to be? Is her score going to go up or is her score going to go down? She gained 12 points, her score is going to go up, so that's going to be a positive integer. In this case, what would 0 represent? Very similar to the bank account question from number 5. Raquel didn't have 0 points and then gained 12. She was probably in the middle of playing her video game and gained 12 more points. So what 0 represents here is the score that Raquel had before she gained points. Again, I just wrote down the score Raquel had before she gained points is what 0 represented. Number 7, Juan went up 25 feet during a climb on a rock climbing wall. Well, is Juan climbing up the wall or is he coming back down? Raquel went up, Juan went up 25 feet. Is that going to be a positive? Is he gaining feet or is he losing feet? Is he climbing down? Well, he's climbing up, so that's going to be a positive integer. And he's going to climb up 25 feet. What does 0 represent here? 0 does not, it doesn't say in this problem that Juan started on the ground. It just says that he went up 25 feet on the climbing wall. So what 0 represents here is where Juan was on the wall before climbing up. So that's what I'm going to write down. 0 represents where Juan was before climbing 25 feet up. Okay, I'm going to slide up a little bit. Number 8. Number 8 says negative 20. The directions tell us write the opposite of the integer. This is, again, this wording is very confusing. And I can't stand that your textbook does this. But it does it, and you might see it on a test in the future. Hint, hint. So we have to go over it. Write the opposite of the opposite. Here we are. Negative 20. Well, what's the opposite of negative 20? The opposite of negative 20 is going to be 20. On the right side of 0. But we want the opposite of the opposite, and that's going to bring us back to negative 20. So the opposite of negative 20 is negative 20. Here we have 4 for number 9. We need the opposite of 4. Well, if we want the opposite of 4, that's going to be negative 4. And then we have to have the opposite of that. Well, that's going to take us back to 4. And my phone is ringing. So I'm going to push pause on the video and be right back. Alright, I'm back from answering the telephone. I'm going to slide my book over a little bit here. Okay, so now I'm on number 10. Number 10 says 95. Well, what's the opposite of 95? Let's start at the beginning. The opposite of 95 is going to be negative 95. And then to get back to 95, right, so it's the opposite of the opposite. So the opposite of 95 is negative 95, and the opposite of that is going to bring us right back to 95 again. Number 11 says the negative 63. We have to find the opposite of that. Well, the opposite of negative 63 is going to be positive 63, and then the opposite of that is going to bring us back to negative 63 again. And I'm sure by this point I'm going extremely slow, and you've probably filled in this entire page with, and aren't even listening to my video anymore. So I'm very mad at you. I'm very, very mad. All right, let's look at number 12. Number 12. Doc Shesh won a game by scoring 25 points. Randy scored the opposite number of points as Doc Shesh. What is Randy's score? Oh boy, Randy did not do well. Well, if Doc Shesh won a game by scoring 25 points and Randy scored the opposite number, well, Randy must have scored, that's right, negative 25 points. I don't even know a game where you can score negative points, but apparently that's what Randy did. Number 13. When Doc Shesh and Randy played the game again, Doc Shesh scored the opposite of his first score. Oh boy. Well, his first score was 25. So I'm going to write that down. But he scored the opposite of 25. Well, the opposite of 25 would take me to negative 25. And then the opposite of that would take me back to 25. So the opposite of the opposite, Doc Shesh scored 25 points. And I should probably label both of these with at least points. Alright, that concludes our flipped lesson for today. The next time you come to IHT, or whatever IHT your teacher's going to be going over your lesson with you, you're going to want to bring your math books with you. Your math books with you. Alright, that's it. I'm Mr. Hassan signing off. See you next time in our flipped classroom.